It's Longrider again. Sorry I've not been working on the Arby and the Chief project. I'll give you a bit of a sneak preview for what I've been planning for it. The Chief has gotten his hands on a laser pointer which he's modified to be a burning laser, and he put that into an action figure-sized Spartan laser and threatens to stir up trouble with it. And that's not even the central premise of the story either, but it's enough to give me a code name for the project. I'm calling it Arby and the Chief, Armed and Dangerous. That's not its real title. When you see the real title, you'll probably bust a few blood vessels, so I'll keep the real title under wraps for now. I really want to do Armed and Dangerous. It's one of the funniest things I've ever written, but it'll be time-consuming, and I'd like to get Snag done with as soon as possible. The editor for making Snag look like whatever you want is really starting to come along. I hope I can release Snag sometime this fall. I hope. Anyhow, I figured I should throw out some thoughts about how paladins will be changing in Cataclysm. I wish I had more time to praise the addition of Holy Power and the primary abilities that they give you at level 10, and the fact that the more vital talents aren't nearly as deep in the trees in the Cataclysm trees as they are now. But this video really deals with the contrast between Blizzard's trees and some fantasy talent trees I made based off of Blizzard's talent trees from their snapshot in July 23. In Blizzard's trees there were a few problems, like a few talents not having sufficient effect for their talent point cost, some talents that were too narrow in that they only improved one ability, and the first and second tiers of a few of the trees didn't have enough incentives to spec into them as a secondary place to put talent points. Of course it's a beta and those trees could literally change completely overnight, but I figured getting some feedback by doing some thought experiments might be helpful at this point, so I used wartools.com and I made some of the changes that I'd like to see. And I should say that while I was making them, my goal was to broaden each talent that seemed too narrow, make sure that I wasn't buffing any one ability too much or too little, and make sure that the lower tiers had varied and useful buffs for each of the other two specs. When the dust settled, I realized that the trees were actually quite bloated indeed, but the bloat might just be a good thing. You'll see what I mean as I go into detail. In my first part I'm going to talk about the lower tier talents, and I'll talk about the higher talents later on in another part. I'll start with Holy. For Tier 1, I didn't do anything. It already looked decent enough for both off-specs, the idea being that Judgments of the Pure would be worthwhile for protection since it increases outgoing damage and therefore threat. But Tier 2 needed some work. I doubled the effect of Clarity of Purpose on our heals since it wasn't quite worth the talent point cost, but I added two side effects that have no impact on a Healadin but help Tankadins and Reddidins. The talent now buffs Avenger's Shield and Divine Storm. Those two abilities didn't seem to get enough love in their respected trees, so I added a talent to boost them here. I broadened the effect of improved Lay on Hands to include Divine Intervention and Light of Dawn, since those are some other Oh Snap buttons, and I renamed it to Revelation, which was a talent from Vanilla WoW that behaved similarly. But the real kicker is what I did to Healing Light. I renamed it Strengthened Light, and since Holy Shock was getting a bit too much love in my opinion, I scaled back its damage to a 15% boost. But here's the thing, instead of just boosting the holy damage of Holy Shock, it boosts all your holy damage by 15%. If you're Retribution and you're into holy damage abilities, all of which are either cooldowns or proc on melee swing, then you'll want this. It's also got its uses for threat for protection if they want it. Of course, you'll have to give up some other things to get this 15% holy damage buff. If you're a Retribution build and you get Strengthened Light, you'll have spent at least 8 points in Holy, so you won't be able to get the Seals of the Pure talent and protection, since I moved it to Tier 2 for this very reason. I switched it with Judgments of the Just, which looks like a damage reducer that could be a good raid buff for any spec that's into raid buffs. Tier 1 of protection looked like it needed quite a bit of work. There was nothing in it that would be beneficial to a Healadin. So I changed toughness so that it improves the amount of strength and spirit that you get from gear, as well as improving the armor you get from gear. But one thing that I did, which is probably going to make a lot of waves, and it could easily have been a big mistake on my part, is what I did to improved Hammer of Justice. I renamed it Swift Justice, and instead of just affecting Hammer of Justice's cooldown, it also affects the cooldown of Holy Shock and, get this, Crusader Strike. As a Healadin, I don't know much about rotations, either for tanking or DPS, but I know enough about them to say that something like this would dramatically change both Protections and Retribution's rotations, maybe even to the point where some Paladins would want this talent and others wouldn't, depending on playstyle. But when you stop and think about it, choosing your talents based on your playstyle sounds like a really good way to customize your character. So even though it was an iffy idea to lower Crusader Strike's cooldown by 1 second, I decided to throw it in there. Anyhow, the only change that I made to Tier 2 protection, which actually looked pretty good to me, was I switched Seals of the Pure with Judgments of the Just. Since the way things were stacking up in terms of damage, I felt that Seals of the Pure had to be out of reach of some specs. I buffed that ability another 5% since I didn't want it to be an exact copy of Strengthened Light. Although Strengthened Light isn't quite the same, it also buffs things like Exorcism and Holy Wrath. Even if standing alone, Seals of the Pure is still lackluster, you can stack it with a lot of other effects, so I think it's okay if it's lackluster standing alone. And now for Retribution's lower tiers in my fantasy tree. I thought that Holy Shock was getting a little bit too much love, so I nerfed Crusade's effect on Holy Shock by 10% and did the same thing for Hammer of the Righteous. But otherwise I left Tier 1 unchanged. I thought it was a really well-designed tier. But Tier 2 Ret I had to make a few changes to. Improved Judgment seemed a bit narrow, but I'd added so much at this point that I was afraid to add a secondary effect to that talent like also improves the amount healed by Word of Glory and Divine Light or anything like that. So instead I decided to bring back an effect that Seal of Command had, and added the caveat that your judgments deal 25% more damage to stunned or incapacitated targets with this talent. That makes it a little bit more dynamic, though maybe 25% wasn't the right number. I left Conviction alone since it looks like a nice talent to have for any spec. Even though Protection isn't geared or spec to have a lot of crits, they'd probably get enough crits to make Conviction worth it. I also added a little PvP perk to Pursuit of Justice. Since Paladins are still very kiteable, I added something to Pursuit of Justice so that if a target is under the effect of Judgment, they'll take additional damage when they move, kind of like a Warrior's Gushing Wound ability. Granted, if they kite you properly, they might stay out of Judgment's range, but if they make a mistake, they'll pay for it, more now than they would otherwise. Now these talents aren't perfect, but let's say that they were in live and you were a Reddit-in, trying to decide where to spend your other 10 talent points. What would your choices be? Well, that 20% buff to your Seals and Judgments in Prot looks nice, but let's take a look at the other stuff that's in Protection. There's a group buff to lower incoming tank DPS, there's a rotation-changing talent, a plus strength talent, a hands boosting talent, and you can get a buff to your auras that boosts healing for everyone for within 40 yards. Now you can't choose them all, of course, but this has a lot of power and utility, both for PvP and PvE, though a lot of that utility revolves around helping other players with things you aren't involved in directly, for instance that Protector of the Innocent talent. It adds some decent DPS buffs though, so if you're into DPS and helping other players out through passive buffs and hand spells, this secondary tree is for you. But if you want to spec yourself to be good at healing as well as DPS, or if you want to specialize in multi-target DPS, then you should probably look at Holy instead. There's a talent there that buffs Divine Storm, and a talent that at least partly makes up for what you can't get from Seals of the Pure, which also buffs the new Holy Wrath spell, which now damages anything and is on a 15-second cooldown. Not to mention some nice plus healing buffs all around in Holy. That's got quite a bit to offer, but mostly if you're into AoE DPS and or healing. So really, which secondary tree you'd want would depend on your playstyle and what you'd like your Redditon to be able to do really well, rather than what does or doesn't have viable synergy for your build. To me, making those choices based on playstyle is an excellent design for the talent trees, and I think it fits in with Blizzard's philosophy quite well. So I wanted them to have a look at these kinds of changes so they could see what was possible if the Tier 1 and Tier 2 talents were broadened. I made other changes deeper in the trees as well, which I'll talk about in my next video.